He never imagined that one day he would experience something so cruel, but that's exactly what happened. It was supposed to be a perfect day, a celebration for his twin sons, Kawan and Kawe, who were turning 12. The house was filled with decorations, the cake was covered with their favorite characters, and there was so much joy in the air as friends and family gathered to celebrate the milestone. He had spent days preparing for this moment, carefully picking out the right gifts, planning the perfect party, and ensuring every little detail was flawless. He watched them run around, full of excitement, their faces lighting up as they looked at the decorations. He could see how much it meant to them. It was the kind of day every parent hopes for, full of laughter, love, and happiness. But as the day went on, a nagging feeling crept up on him. It wasn't a feeling of fear, just an uneasy sense of something not quite right. He pushed it aside, telling himself it was probably just nerves. It had been a busy week preparing for this celebration after all. They had just finished singing Happy Birthday, and the twins were eagerly waiting for their turn to blow out the candles. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride in that moment, his children, happy, healthy, and full of life. But then, everything shifted. Kawan, the older of the two by just a few minutes, suddenly turned pale. His face was flushed, his breathing erratic, and before he could even react, Kawan staggered forward and collapsed on the floor. A wave of panic surged through him. His wife, Fabiana, rushed to Kawan's side, calling out his name, but the look on her face said it all. It was too late. Then, just as quickly, he turned to see Kawe, his other son, standing by, but he too was struggling to stay upright. His eyes were wide, filled with terror, and before anyone could reach him, Kawe collapsed to the ground as well. The room was silent, everything frozen. Time felt like it had stopped. He rushed to his sons, his heart pounding in his chest, but it was as if his own body had turned to stone. His breathing grew heavy, and before he could make sense of what was happening, he too felt the same sensation of weakness creeping over him. His vision blurred, his chest tightened, and just as he reached out to his children, everything went dark. He didn't even hear the screams of those around him, the frantic calls for help, the desperate attempts to revive them. All he could feel was the cold rush of unconsciousness pulling him under. The world faded away, and the next thing he knew, he was no longer part of the celebration. His body, along with his children's, had fallen victim to something much darker. It was a moment that, in the blink of an eye, changed everything. When he woke up, everything felt wrong. He didn't understand at first. His body was sore, heavy, as though he had been through something far more intense than just a fall. He tried to move, but his limbs felt numb. The air around him was thick, and he couldn't see anything at first. The first thing that came to mind was that something had happened, something big, and it wasn't good. His chest tightened as panic started to creep in. He opened his eyes slowly, and what he saw made his heart race even faster. It wasn't what he expected. He wasn't at home. He wasn't in a hospital. He was in a tight, dark space. The wood around him felt solid, unyielding and cold. His first instinct was to scream, but his throat felt dry as though it hadn't been used in hours. His head throbbed, and it took a moment to gather his thoughts. Was this some kind of joke? A prank gone too far? But then it hit him. He wasn't alone. He could feel the presence of his children beside him. Their bodies were so close that he could barely breathe without feeling them there. But there was something more terrifying than their proximity. They weren't moving. They weren't breathing. They were lying still, their bodies limp beside his. He reached out to them, shaking, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Kawan, Kawe," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. But they didn't respond. The silence was deafening, and the weight of that silence pressed against him like the very air around him was suffocating him. His mind raced as he tried to think back to what had happened, but all he could remember were flashes. The cake, the candles, Kawan's words about not feeling well, then everything fading into darkness. Slowly, panic turned to realization. He wasn't dead. They weren't dead, but they had been buried alive, and somehow they were still alive, trapped in this coffin. The weight of the situation hit him like a ton of bricks. and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. How could this be happening? Why? Who would do this to them? The questions flooded his mind, and the answers seemed too far away to reach. His heart raced as he scrambled to move, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. His hands trembled as he reached for his sons again. He had to wake them up, had to get them out of there. He had to fight. As his fingers brushed across Kawan's cheek, he felt something. Slight, but there. A breath. A heartbeat. Something. He wasn't sure if it was real, but it was enough. He shook Kawan's shoulder desperately, whispering louder now, hoping for some kind of response. Please, please wake up, son. Wake up. His voice was shaky, barely audible, but he had to keep trying. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kawan's eyes fluttered open. It wasn't much, just a flicker of recognition, but it was enough to give him hope. His son was alive. That was all he needed to know. It felt like the world had shifted again. He wasn't alone in this nightmare, and maybe, just maybe, they could get out. He wasn't ready to give up yet. There was still a chance. The minutes dragged on, and with each passing second, the gravity of their situation sank deeper into him. Kawan was alive, but barely. His eyes were dazed, his body weak, but at least he was breathing. Now, if only he could wake Kawe. The panic that had once been overwhelming began to give way to something else. Determination. He wasn't about to let his children die, not like this. They had already been through too much. He felt the dirt and wood pressing down on him, as though the whole world had conspired against them, and yet, somehow, they had managed to survive. He knew that they couldn't stay there for long. The air was growing thin, and the fear of suffocating trapped in that box was enough to make him fight harder. He turned to Kawe, shaking him gently at first, then harder as his frustration grew. Kawe, wake up, you have to wake up. He kept repeating it as though the words could somehow make it happen. His son didn't respond, but there was still a spark of hope. He wasn't sure why he was so certain, but deep down he knew that they had to get out of there. His hand brushed against the cold metal of a small object in his pocket, and when he felt it, his heart skipped a beat. It was his phone. The thought that it might still work made his pulse race. He pulled it out quickly, trying not to panic, and saw that it had a faint signal. There was no time to wonder how or why. It was enough. His fingers fumbled as he unlocked the phone, his hands shaking with urgency. He needed to call for help, to get them out. The screen lit up, and there, sitting idle on the home screen, was a video. He didn't have time to question it. He pressed play. The video started, and he watched in confusion as the camera panned across a coffin, the inside of which was eerily familiar. There he saw a metal compartment beneath the woman's body. The video was clear. Inside the compartment were 3 oxygen masks. His breath caught in his throat. He understood immediately. Someone had orchestrated all of this. Someone had planned for them to be buried alive, and they had been prepared for this moment. The realization hit him hard. They hadn't been randomly buried. This was a deliberate act. He wasn't sure who had done this or why, but as he continued to watch the video, he saw a figure wearing a mask. The voice was distorted, cold as it spoke. The air will soon run out. Use the masks. Everything will be fine. Panic surged again as he realized what this meant. He had been buried alive, but someone had known this would happen. Someone had wanted it to happen. His chest tightened as he fought to understand who could have done such a thing, but the truth remained elusive. With trembling hands, he grabbed the oxygen masks from the compartment beneath him, fitting one over Kawan's face and then one over Kawe's. There was no time to waste. He forced the mask over his own face, praying it would help them breathe better. The air, though thin, began to feel a little easier to take in. His heart was still racing, his thoughts frantic, but they had a chance now. They weren't dead. Not yet. And he wasn't going to let them die in that grave. The seconds felt like hours, and every breath was a struggle, but there was something else now. A sliver of hope that he couldn't shake. He wasn't sure how long they'd been trapped in that coffin, but the longer they stayed in the dark, the more his thoughts spiraled. Who would want to bury them alive? The phone call he'd been able to make for help was useless, and the video had only raised more questions. No answers. No clear path out. He stared at Kawan, whose eyes were barely open, trying to focus on his father. "It's going to be okay, son. We're going to get out of here." He couldn't believe the words as they left his mouth, but he said them anyway. For Kawan. For Kawe. They had to survive. It wasn't just about getting out of the box. It was about finding out who did this to them, why it was happening. They deserved answers. But more importantly, they deserved justice. He could feel the faintest tremor run through Kawan's body, a sign that his son was fighting to stay conscious. The sight filled him with a mixture of relief and fear. Would they survive long enough to get out? Would they ever make it to the surface? To safety? His heart raced as he realized just how much time was slipping away. Every breath felt harder, every second stretching longer. His own breathing became shallow, the mask providing just enough oxygen to keep him from suffocating. But it was clear they were running out of time. The weight of the moment felt crushing, and for a split second, he let his mind wander back to that day, the day of the celebration, when everything had been perfect, when his family had been full of life, laughing together. What had gone wrong? What had caused them to end up like this, buried alive, struggling for their lives in the dark? It didn't make sense. But there was no time for answers now. His sons needed him. He needed them. He couldn't lose them. No matter what it took, no matter the odds, he wouldn't let this be the end of their story. And that's when he heard it. The sound of shovels scraping against the dirt above them. At first he thought it was his mind playing tricks, but then the noise grew louder. Someone was coming. Someone was digging. He wasn't sure who, but he didn't care. All that mattered was that they were here, and they were coming for him and his children. His breath caught in his throat, a mix of fear and hope rising within him. Could they be saved? Could someone have finally realized they weren't dead after all? Or was this just another cruel twist in the nightmare they were living? He didn't know, but it was the first sound of hope he'd heard since they were trapped. The sound of shovels in the dirt was like music to his ears, a sign that someone might be coming to rescue them. But the seconds seemed to drag by, and the fear of being too late crept back in. Was it too soon for rescue? Were they already beyond saving? No. He refused to believe that. Not today. Not when there was a chance. The sound of shovels scraping against the earth grew louder, more distinct, and for a brief moment he dared to believe that they might actually make it out. His heart pounded in his chest as he clung to the hope that someone, anyone, was coming to help. Every muscle in his body screamed for action, but all he could do was wait. The air in the coffin was growing increasingly stale, and despite the oxygen masks, he could feel the suffocation creeping in. Kawan was still breathing, but it was faint, and Kawe's breaths were even more shallow. His sons were still with him, but for how much longer? He couldn't let go of the thought that they might not make it. The noise above them, though promising, felt distant, like a dream he wasn't sure was real. What if it was just his mind, trying to hold on to a lifeline? What if it was too late? He tried to shake off the doubts, but they lingered like a shadow, darkening every hope he had. Then suddenly, the noise stopped. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing but silence. His heart skipped a beat. Was someone really digging, or had it all been a figment of his imagination? The silence was deafening. His mind raced through every possibility, every worst-case scenario. He couldn't afford to lose this chance, not after everything they had been through. Desperation crept in and he shouted, his voice raw and weak. "Help! Please help us!" His voice was barely audible, but it felt like the only thing he could do. He couldn't let himself believe that after everything, no one would come for them. Then, just as quickly as the silence had come, the sound of digging returned. Closer now. His chest tightened with anticipation. He could feel the vibrations of the shovel striking the dirt, and then he heard it. A voice. It was muffled at first, but unmistakable. Someone was calling out. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. It was a voice of reassurance. His mind screamed for them to keep going, to keep digging, but he couldn't find the strength to shout again. All he could do was lie there, trying to stay conscious, praying that the person digging above them wasn't just another cruel twist of fate. The seconds felt like hours, but finally, the first shovelful of dirt was pulled away from above the coffin, followed by another. He could see the faintest hint of light seeping through the cracks. They were close. Someone was actually getting through to them. His heart surged with hope, and as the dirt above him was cleared away, he could hear the muffled sound of voices growing louder, closer. He didn't know who it was, but at that moment, it didn't matter. Help was coming. They weren't going to die in this grave. They were going to survive. The weight of the dirt above him started to feel lighter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe they might make it out of there. The realization hit him like a wave. There was a chance, a real chance. They weren't finished yet. He wasn't finished yet. The moment the last bit of dirt was removed from above them, a rush of fresh air poured into the coffin, and he inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the much-needed oxygen. It was as if the world had shifted in that instant, from despair to a fleeting glimpse of hope. But just as quickly as the air filled his lungs, fear began to rise again. They were still trapped. It wasn't over yet. He could hear the voices from above, but the thought of them not being able to get them out in time, or of something going wrong, made him feel powerless. But there was no more time to waste. The light above grew brighter, and the sound of hands scrambling, the rustling of dirt being cleared away, became louder. He could feel the pressure lifting as someone worked with urgency, and then, just like that, the top of the coffin was open. A man's face appeared, eyes wide with shock and concern, his hands outstretched toward them. "We've got you," he said, though his voice was faint, almost as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing either. His vision was still blurry, and his body felt like lead as he tried to sit up. But seeing the person above them was like a spark in the darkness. The man reached down and pulled him out first, then helped Kawan, who was still too weak to move on his own. Kawe was next, but he remained limp, too frail to hold on to the hope that they were free. He felt the urgency in the man's hands as they worked quickly to move them out of the grave, out of the coffin that had nearly claimed their lives. But as the fresh air hit his skin, it felt as if he could finally breathe again, like he was seeing the world through a new set of eyes. He wasn't sure who had come for them, whether it was a passerby, someone from the funeral, or even a rescue team. But he knew one thing. They were alive. They were out. They had made it. His sons were breathing, though barely, and they were free from the nightmare they had been trapped in. A strange mixture of relief and disbelief washed over him as he realized what had just happened. They had been buried alive. And now, they were free. But there was no time to celebrate. They had to get medical attention. They had to get out of there, far away from whatever had led them to this point. The man who had pulled them out was already on the phone calling for an ambulance, his voice frantic as he explained the situation. As they were carefully lifted into the back of the ambulance, the reality of the situation began to sink in. He wasn't sure how to process it, how to understand how something like this could happen. But as the doors of the ambulance closed, he found himself holding his sons tightly, whispering words of reassurance to them. They had survived, and now the real battle would begin, finding out who had done this to them, and why. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, everything felt like a blur. The flashing lights outside, the hum of the sirens, the cold air rushing in through the open windows. It was all too much. His mind was racing with thoughts, trying to piece together the events that had unfolded, trying to make sense of how they had gone from a normal birthday celebration to being buried alive in a coffin. But there was no time for answers now. His sons were still weak, barely able to keep their eyes open, and that's when the flood of emotions hit him all at once. The terror, the helplessness, the overwhelming gratitude. He was still holding Kawan's hand tightly, his fingers trembling as he reassured him once again that everything was going to be okay. But deep down, he knew the journey ahead would be anything but easy. They had been through something no one should ever have to face, and as much as he tried to push away the fear, it lingered, creeping into his thoughts. He couldn't help but wonder who had done this to them, and why. What kind of person could bury a family alive, could go to such lengths to cause this kind of suffering? It didn't make sense. And he knew that the answers wouldn't come easily. The ambulance came to a stop outside the hospital, and he felt a surge of relief mixed with fear. The doctors and nurses rushed to help them, their faces grim but determined. They were in good hands now, he thought, but still the fear lingered. As they were wheeled into the emergency room, he heard a voice calling his name. It was a familiar voice. His wife, Fabiana. He hadn't seen her since the moment they collapsed. But there she was, standing at the door, her face pale and filled with worry. As soon as she saw him, her face broke into a look of pure relief. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she touched his face. It felt like a dream, a surreal moment that he couldn't fully process. She had been so scared. She had seen him collapse. She had watched him and her children seemingly lifeless. He tried to smile at her, tried to reassure her, but words failed him. They had made it out, yes. But the weight of what had happened, of what they had been through, was still too much to comprehend. Fabiana looked at him and then at Kawan and Kawe. Her eyes filled with tears as she held them close. The doctors began their work, checking vitals, hooking them up to machines and asking questions. But the truth was, none of it mattered right now. The only thing that mattered was that they were alive. They had survived something that most people would never even imagine. But the feeling of relief quickly shifted to something else, something he hadn't been ready for. The question that had been gnawing at him finally bubbled up to the surface. Who did this to them? Why? And as he sat there holding his sons and his wife, surrounded by doctors and the sound of beeping machines, he knew that this wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of hospital rooms, medical tests, and constant monitoring. His sons were still weak, their bodies slowly recovering from the trauma they had endured. But the real battle was far from over. While the doctors worked to ensure they were physically okay, there was no denying the mental scars they would carry forever. Kawan and Kawe had been through something no child should ever experience. The nightmares began almost immediately. He could hear them calling out in their sleep, their voices shaking with fear. He had tried to reassure them, telling them it was all over now, but he knew that the trauma wasn't something that could be fixed with a few comforting words. He watched as Fabiana, too, struggled with the weight of what had happened. She had been through the unimaginable, thinking that she had lost her entire family, only to find out that they were buried alive, fighting for their lives. There was no guide for this kind of grief, no way to explain the horror of watching your family seemingly vanish in an instant. He could see the pain in her eyes every time she looked at them, every time she held them close. But for now, they were alive, and that was something they could hold on to. It wasn't much, but it was everything. The police came shortly after, asking questions, trying to piece together the puzzle of what had happened. They were quick to identify that something sinister had been at play. They knew that a family didn't just collapse and die together without a cause, but even though they had their suspicions, there were no clear answers yet. All they had was a family who had survived against the odds, and a sense that someone somewhere was responsible for what had happened to them. The investigation began, but it felt like they were still in the dark. The weeks that followed were filled with a sense of uncertainty, but through it all, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone close to them, someone they had trusted, had betrayed them. He didn't know how or why, but he knew in his gut that the person who had done this was someone who had been there, someone who had been part of their lives. And it made him sick. He had trusted them. He had let them into his family. Now he was left with this overwhelming feeling of betrayal. As the days went on, the weight of it all began to settle in. The air in the hospital room was thick with it, the tension, the unanswered questions, the desperate need for closure. But despite it all, he refused to let it break him. He had seen his sons suffer. He had lived through the worst kind of fear, but he wasn't going to let it defeat him. Not now. Not when they had come so far. They had been buried alive, but they were alive. And he wasn't about to let that be in vain. The investigation into what had happened to them became more intense as the days passed. Detectives started asking more detailed questions, combing through every piece of evidence, trying to find out who could have been behind the horrifying ordeal. They questioned family members, friends, anyone who had been around them. And slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just a random tragedy. It was a planned attack, a deliberate attempt on their lives. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow, but the truth started to surface. Moises, his wife's husband, the man who had seemed so devoted, had been the mastermind behind it all. The realization hit him like a slap in the face. Moises had orchestrated everything. He had planned to kill his family, to make it look like an accident and then take everything for himself. The betrayal ran deeper than he could have ever imagined. He had trusted Moises, had invited him into their home, into their lives. And for what? For greed, for power, for money. Moises had never loved Fabiana or the kids. He had only wanted the wealth she had inherited. And when the opportunity arose, he took it. They found evidence of his plotting. Poison, traces of the same substance used to make them feel as if they were dead, and most chilling of all, the confession from a person close to him. It wasn't just the poisoning that had almost killed them. It was his indifference to their lives. He had been willing to bury them alive, and he had done it without hesitation. At first, when the police confronted him with the evidence, Moises denied everything. He claimed that he was innocent, that there had to be some mistake. But as more pieces of evidence came to light, as witnesses came forward, his lies fell apart. There was no denying it. Moises was guilty, and the truth was out. Fabiana, who had been living with a sense of betrayal and shock, finally allowed herself to feel something else: anger. But it wasn't the kind of anger that consumed her. It was the kind of anger that gave her strength. The strength to move on, to rebuild her life, to protect her children. She no longer had to live in fear. Moises was going to pay for what he had done, and for the first time in a long time, she could breathe freely. The justice they had been waiting for was finally within reach. It was a long road ahead, but they were going to get through it. Together. The trial was intense. There were moments when he thought he couldn't handle it, when the weight of everything they'd been through threatened to swallow him whole. But through it all, he found strength in his family, in his wife, and in his sons. They sat together in that courtroom, their eyes fixed on Moises, who sat there like a shell of the man they once knew. He looked smaller now, insignificant, his lies unraveling with every piece of evidence. Fabiana sat beside him, her hand resting on his, and for the first time in months, he could see the relief in her eyes. The justice they had been waiting for was finally within their grasp. They had fought for this moment, and now it was here. The moment Moises was sentenced to prison felt surreal. When the judge spoke the words, he could hardly believe it. But as he looked at Fabiana, at Kawan and Kawe, he knew it was real. Moises would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and the family would finally be free. The trauma would never fully disappear, but they were survivors. They had endured the worst, and now they had the chance to rebuild their lives. The years ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were no longer trapped in the shadow of Moises' manipulation and cruelty. They had found the strength to move on, to take back control of their lives and to heal. As he stood there, holding his sons close, he realized just how much they had lost and how much they had gained. The scars would always be there, but they were no longer defined by the nightmare that had nearly destroyed them. They were a family that had fought back. They had been buried alive, but they had come back stronger, and they would never let the darkness consume them again. From that day on, they would choose hope, they would choose life, and they would choose each other.